Hey guys, tonight we saddle up for a journey into the chilly, windswept heart of Central Asia, where the ground is dry, the goats are loud, and romance is mostly an afterthought. You're about to crawl into a felt-lined yurt somewhere near the year 1206, just as a man named Temüjin is about to rebrand himself as Genghis Khan and ruin everyone's romantic expectations for the next 100 years. The stars above the steppe blaze sharp and clear, and the smell of fermented mare's milk hangs in the air like an open dare. Mongol society was fast, mobile, and brutally practical. There were no candlelit dinners, there were no bathtubs, and there was definitely no time for slow dancing unless you counted a two-horse collision at full gallop. You probably won't survive this, at least not with your modern ideas of seduction intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is over there, especially if you're drifting off with the wind of the steppe in your ears. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying in a yurt, a circular tent made of wood, canvas, and horsehair, warmed by a dung-fueled stove and insulated with the body heat of your extended family and maybe a sheep. This is home. Private space? Never heard of it. Your bedroom is a mat on the floor next to your siblings, your parents, possibly your aunt, and a neighbor who dropped in after her yak cart broke a wheel. The Mongol Empire, for all its terrifying efficiency in conquering half the known world, wasn't exactly a place that prioritized sensuality. You don't build the largest land empire in history by stopping to light incense. Still, human beings are gonna human. Even on the move, people found ways to fall in love, or at least in lust, and sometimes they didn't wait until the horses were fully unpacked. But conditions weren't exactly inspiring. The ground is cold, the wind leaks through the seams of your tent, and the animals do not stop farting. Ever. Mongol yurts were round and cozy, yes, but cozy often meant you can hear everything your uncle's doing with his wife on the other side of the stove. And it wasn't just the lack of privacy. Cleanliness was, shall we say, interpretive. While Mongols were actually quite tidy by the standards of the time, bathing in rivers, brushing their hair with carved bone combs, bathing every day was seen as dangerous to health. Instead, they smoked their clothes over burning herbs, which meant your average romantic encounter smelled less like roses and more like smoked beef jerky that's been through a dust storm. You roll over in your shared bedroll, trying not to make eye contact with your cousin who's breathing way too loudly. The tent flap rustles. Someone steps out to pee. Someone else steps in with a fermented milk jug and absolutely no concept of boundaries. In this world, sex isn't private. It's part of life. Like milking horses or stitching saddlebags. No one pretends it doesn't happen, but no one gets poetic about it either. The practical rhythms of nomadic life don't leave much room for longing gazes and stolen kisses. You're more likely to get kicked in the shin by a sheep mid-kiss than to be swept off your feet. And yet, it wasn't all grim. Mongol society gave women more freedom than in many neighboring cultures. Women could ride, shoot, inherit property, even command troops. And yes, they chose their own husbands, at least sometimes. More on that in a bit. Our first true story comes from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, where she references the surprisingly efficient romantic habits of ruling elites, including those within Genghis Khan's own court. He had many wives and even more concubines, but his first and favorite, Berthe, remained uniquely powerful. Genghis's love for her was apparently deep enough that when she was kidnapped early in their marriage, he launched a rescue raid, slaying enemies left and right to get her back. Romantic? Possibly. Strategic? Definitely. Historians still argue whether Berthe's influence shaped Mongol policy or if she was simply a well-treated wife in a deeply patriarchal society. Either way, her status gave her access to authority and occasionally to power over other women in the harem. Now, here's your quirky tidbit. According to some steppe legends, Mongols believed the stars above the ger roof could watch you at night. That little smoke hole at the center of the ceiling? Yeah, eyes. Which is why some people, especially elders, would drape a scarf or a blanket over it if things got too steamy. Because the ancestors were watching, and no one wants their great-grandpa silently judging their technique. So you lie there in the dark, the fire popping, your toes half numb from cold, and you wonder, how did love survive here? How did desire not just shrivel up and get blown away like sand in the wind? The answer, perhaps, lies in adaptation. Mongol couples didn't need violins and rose petals. They needed mutual respect, strength, and the ability to saddle a horse while arguing. And when the night wind howled across the plain, maybe a shared blanket and a whispered joke were all the romance you could hope for. You wake up to the sound of hooves clopping by your head. It's morning in the Jur, and the entire place smells like boiled mutton, felt boots, and a vague whiff of fermented horse milk that someone left uncorked. The hearth has gone cold. Your aunt is already up, churning yogurt with one hand and scolding a goat with the other. Someone just stepped over you to get to the saddlebag near the flap, and you realize, if anyone was trying to have a private romantic moment in this space last night, they failed. Because when it comes to sex in the Mongol Empire, there's one word that keeps showing up in the emotional glossary of nomadic living: exposure. Yurts, called gurs in Mongolian, weren't just homes. They were architectural symbols of everything communal. Circular, open, and without any kind of separate room, they were efficient, portable, and totally opposed to the concept of alone time. If someone was in the mood, they'd better hope everyone else was asleep, deeply invested in sewing, or out herding something on the far side of a sand dune. And still, people made do. Mongol life moved fast, but it didn't skip the messy realities of attraction. Couples stole time together wherever they could, behind carts, under cloaks, in bathhouses made of steam tents if they were lucky. But mostly, it happened right there, in the same open space as grandma. Which brings us to an uncomfortable truth. Romance in this society was incredibly public. There were no closed doors to slam during arguments, no sock on the door rituals, no Netflix and chill equivalent unless Netflix was a cow skull and chilling meant literally freezing in sub-zero temperatures. That goat in the corner? It's seen things. Now let's talk logistics. Jur interiors followed a sort of unwritten feng shui. The male head of the household slept on the west side, the wife on the east, and guests toward the north. Sacred objects were stored in the south, near the door. Every inch had meaning, and unfortunately for hopeful lovers, no inch was private. That brings us to today's featured tale, straight from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, about a traveling court poet who described visiting a Mongol encampment during a diplomatic mission. He noted, somewhat alarmed, that while the people were warm, generous, and free with their thoughts, the concept of discretion didn't quite exist. In his account, a couple began arguing across the Jur about whether or not they should sleep together that night, while the poet sat cross-legged between them, politely sipping yak butter tea. Was it awkward? Sure, but to them it was just Tuesday. And this openness didn't stop at married couples. Courting among the young was also often a public affair. A young man might demonstrate his interest by offering gifts: a length of silk, a small carved comb, a slightly terrifying pickled bird foot. Romance. If she accepted, they might sneak off to sit together, share a song, or wrestle, literally. Mongols loved wrestling, and sometimes it was flirting. Other times, foreplay. The lines blurred. Still, intimacy had boundaries, just not the ones we're used to. Unmarried women, especially daughters of nobles or powerful clans, were protected fiercely. If a man crossed the line without permission, it wasn't just awkward. It could spark a blood feud that lasted generations. And by blood feud, we mean actual arrows and horses and somebody's sheep pen mysteriously catching fire. Historians still argue whether these codes of honor were enforced consistently or mainly applied to elites. For commoners, the rules may have been a little looser, if not entirely clear. But one thing's certain: communal life didn't leave much room for secrets. Here's your quirky tidbit of the night. In some jurs, there was a tradition of covering the ears of children with wool caps if parents intended to, Not so much to protect their hearing, but to keep spirits from entering through the ears during intimate thunder, as one elder allegedly put it. Of course, whether this actually happened or is just an apocryphal flourish remains open to scholarly bickering, but it makes a good mental image. Picture it: a child in a fuzzy hat, fast asleep, while the stars judge quietly through the roof. Now, if you're wondering how this all worked during the coldest parts of the year, when people were stuck indoors together for weeks at a time, huddled for warmth, it got even more complicated. Tensions ran high, privacy was nil, and a single broken taboo could echo across the clan like a yodel in a canyon. There's a documented case of a newlywed couple who, unable to wait for privacy, made a go of it during a family gathering. The result? Not scandal, but a series of passive-aggressive toasts over dinner. The groom's uncle raised a bowl of fermented milk and said, "To the strength of young warriors, may they know how to wait next time." Ouch. So tonight, as you nestle deeper into your imaginary bedroll, think of the people of the steppe trying to find intimacy, not in silk sheets and moonlit balconies, but in wool blankets and awkward silences, while trying not to roll into the fire pit. It wasn't sexy, but it was real. And sometimes real is messier, funnier, and more human than any fantasy scroll. Your bones are still stiff from sleeping on a wool mat, but there's no time to stretch. This is conquest season. Outside the yurt, the steppe ripples under the wind like a giant shaggy fur cloak. Horses are being saddled, arrows inspected, stirrups adjusted with terrifying efficiency. The men are armored up, the women are packing rations, and across the horizon the dust of mobilization hangs low. And riding ahead of them all, with a jawline carved from granite and ambition taller than the Altai Mountains, is Genghis Khan. Let's be clear, you're not going to swipe right on this guy. He's not here for candlelit anything. Genghis Khan, born as Temüjin, came of age in a world where power didn't just corrupt, it seduced. And in the vast legend of his military genius, we often skip over the less flattering footnotes, like the fact that his approach to sex, love, and marriage was about as tender as a boot to the head. Genghis didn't just conquer cities, he claimed the people inside them, and that often meant women. Many, many women. Historians still argue whether Genghis saw sexual conquest as a political tool or simply a privilege of power. But what we do know is that the man left a legacy in the DNA database. No, really. A 2003 genetic study found that about 1 in 200 men alive today may carry a Y chromosome traceable to a single male ancestor in the Mongol region, widely believed to be Genghis himself, which means somewhere out there, someone's flirting in a bar with eyebrows they didn't know were imperial. One of the most infamous episodes in Genghis's sexual legacy comes from his early years of marriage. His wife, Berte, yes, the one he loved, was kidnapped by a rival clan and held for several months. When Temüjin rescued her, she was pregnant. Did he question the child's paternity? Possibly. Did he raise the boy as his own? Absolutely. That boy Jochi would go on to become a powerful military leader and a walking scandal. This matter of Jochi's paternity was never settled. Some Mongol nobles whispered about it for years. Others accepted it as irrelevant, but it seeded tension within the family, especially between Jochi and his brothers. Even death couldn't end the debate. Historians still puzzle over whether Genghis's embrace of Jochi was genuine or strategic or both. In the steppe, bloodlines mattered, but survival mattered more. And so the empire grew. And with every victory, Genghis took not only territory but people, captives, prisoners, and yes, women. Entire harems were relocated across the empire, their purposes quietly documented in the dusty ledgers of imperial logistics. This brings us to a particular story from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, which includes a Mongol general, a close ally of Genghis, who kept a traveling tent specifically for war brides. A rotation of women acquired during campaigns, rotated like supplies, often discarded or married off when political convenience demanded. Romance? Nope. Inventory management. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Genghis Khan was famously terrified of dogs. He believed they could see the soul, and one folktale claimed that a barking dog once interrupted him mid-courtship. He took it as a divine warning and left the tent. The woman? Married off 2 days later to a soldier with fewer supernatural hang-ups. Was this a common superstition? Maybe not, but it does tell us something important. Even history's most brutal figures sometimes paused for signs and omens, or possibly just didn't like getting barked at during their alone time. And that's the paradox of Genghis Khan. He built a meritocracy, passed progressive laws for women by 13th century standards, and allowed religious tolerance. Yet he also viewed human relationships through a lens of dominance, utility, and control. His marriages were often arranged for alliances. His affairs were often seizures of power dressed up as romance. What's fascinating is how the Mongol system didn't see this as cruelty, but as natural order. Women of the steppes weren't powerless. They rode, fought, and managed estates. But within the sphere of conquest, they were also commodities, marriageable assets, bargaining chips, or trophies. That duality lives in the Mongol chronicles. Women as advisors and women as spoils. And here's the kicker. Many of those same chronicles were written long after Genghis's death, sometimes by Persian scribes or Chinese historians, each with their own biases. Some portrayed him as a barbarian, others as a hero. The truth likely lies somewhere in the dust between. Tonight, as you listen to the wind outside your tent flap, imagine being one of those women brought into the imperial fold. Some became queens, some became concubines, some disappeared from the record entirely. Their voices are mostly lost, but the impact of their presence echoes in marriages, treaties, and the genetic web stretching from Mongolia to Hungary. It wasn't love, it wasn't lust, it was empire, tangled with flesh and blood. And so you roll over, pulling your wool blanket closer, feeling the press of history settle in like another weight on your chest. Genghis Khan, conqueror of hearts, not through seduction, but through storm. You're not royalty. You're just an average young Mongol woman or man of marrying age, and today's the big day. Not because you're in love, but because your uncle traded you for a particularly handsome horse. He says it has a good gait and responds well to whistling. So, congratulations, you're now engaged. Marriage in the Mongol Empire wasn't about flowers, champagne, or even particularly knowing the person in question. It was often about alliances, livestock, and keeping your clan on good terms with the neighbors. Romantic? Not quite. Strategic? Absolutely. If you're a woman, your future husband likely came with a decent herd, good teeth, and the ability to throw a spear from horseback. If you're a man, your bride's worth might be measured in wool, weaving skills, and whether her family owns any wagons that don't fall apart on muddy terrain. That's not to say love never bloomed, it just bloomed within boundaries. After all, you're going to be spending a lot of time together building fires, raising children, and avoiding wolf attacks. Emotional connection tends to sprout eventually. But the wedding itself? Oh, it's a whole production. First, the proposal, which often happened via family negotiations rather than candlelit dinners. A suitor might send a go-between to make the offer, often a respected elder, sometimes a cousin with decent storytelling skills. If the families agreed, a kalim, bride price, would be negotiated. This might include livestock, tools, or items like silk or saddles if the suitor was really showing off. Once accepted, you wouldn't necessarily move in right away. The groom might work for your family for a year or more, sort of like a son-in-law internship, especially if he didn't have the bride price. During that time, you might get to know each other, or not. Now, let's peek into one of these weddings. Picture a flat, wind-battered plain, a circle of gurs pitched in celebration, food steaming in open pots, and guests already slightly tipsy on fermented mare's milk. You're dressed in your finest robe, which is mostly wool and optimism. Your hair is braided with bits of bone and beads. Your husband-to-be is outside, arm wrestling his cousins to prove his virility. The ceremony itself? Simple. A shaman might bless the union, or your families might just exchange formal toasts. In some cases, the bride was carried off in a ritual kidnapping, a symbolic gesture of being taken into a new household, though sometimes this veiled genuine abduction. Historians still debate whether this tradition empowered women by dramatizing choice or concealed coercion behind pageantry. And now for your first night together. Here's where it gets ceremonial. The bridal tent, if you're lucky enough to get one, is a specially set up ger away from the main cluster. Decorated with symbolic patterns and stocked with food, it's meant to give you one blessed night of privacy. But the next morning, everyone wants to know how it went. Which brings us to tonight's featured story. A particularly awkward account from a Chinese envoy who observed a Mongol wedding between a prominent warlord's daughter and a minor prince. According to his report, the wedding night was not only attended by the immediate family, outside the ger, thankfully, but followed by a group inspection of the bed linens to confirm that the bride was a virgin. Yes, that was a thing. This practice wasn't unique to Mongols, but it did happen often enough that the linens became a kind of proof of concept for family honor. If blood was present, the bride had done her duty. If not, well, explanations would be demanded. Sometimes the elder women would chime in with theories about diet, temperament, or even humidity. Others blamed spirits or the angle of the moon. No pressure or anything. Quirky tidbit: there's a Mongol proverb that says, "A strong horse makes a good husband, but a stubborn mare makes an honest wife." No one's entirely sure what this means, but it was often quoted during toasts, usually by uncles who'd had too much irog. But let's not paint the whole empire with a single brush. Not all marriages were arranged. Not all love was transactional. There were runaways, forbidden courtships, even elopements. Folk songs from the period tell of girls who fled their arranged matches to be with shepherd boys, or young men who composed poems to woo warriors' daughters. Love had to find sneaky little paths under the tent flaps. And Mongol women had more agency than in many parts of the world at the time. They could divorce. They could remarry. They often controlled household wealth. Some even refused suitors outright, especially if the bride price wasn't worth the trouble. Still, it's hard not to feel a little sympathy when you think about that girl sitting in her wedding chair, staring at her new husband across a steaming bowl of mutton stew, wondering if this is what the rest of her life smells like. Outside, her uncle is already trying to trade another niece for a particularly attractive yak. Inside, the fire crackles, the blankets are scratchy, and love, if it's going to grow, better be as tough as the wind that never stops blowing. You're starting to feel at home in your yurt now, even if the wind outside still sounds like an angry ancestor with a grudge. The fire's low, the goats are finally quiet, and your new husband is asleep beside you, snoring gently, like a man who's never had to test his own bed linens for ceremonial bloodstains. But just when you thought you'd earned some peace, in walks wife number 2. Because here's the thing. In the Mongol Empire, marriage was not a strictly one-on-one affair. Polygamy was common, especially among men of power and wealth. If you could support them, you could marry them. That meant multiple wives, multiple tents, and multiple chances to accidentally call someone the wrong name during dinner. And don't even get started on concubines. Secondary wives weren't just background characters. They held real status in the household. They had their own gers, their own responsibilities, and sometimes their own mini-dramas that would make modern reality TV blush. But their rank always depended on their origin. A noblewoman taken in marriage was likely to have more influence than, say, a concubine captured during a military campaign. Still, life in a multi-wife household was more structured than you'd expect. Each wife had her own domain. The first wife held the title of senior, oversaw food distribution, children's education, and often household politics. She wasn't just the romantic lead, she was the CEO of the yurt. Which brings us to Berte, Genghis Khan's first and chief wife. Even after Genghis accumulated a small army of wives and concubines, Berte remained the top ranked. Her tent was placed in the center of the royal encampment, geographically and symbolically. Everyone else was stationed on the periphery. If Genghis died, spoiler, he eventually did, it was her sons who would claim the succession rights first. But secondary wives had their own moments of power. Some ran trade networks, others commanded troops in emergencies. A few even acted as regents during times of political instability. Still, it wasn't always harmonious. Here's tonight's featured tale. The story of a concubine named Hoelun, not to be confused with Genghis's mother, also named Hoelun. Mongol names were sometimes delightfully repetitive. This Hoelun was taken from a noble Persian family after her city fell to the Mongol horde. Instead of sulking in her new reality, she quickly won favor with her Mongol husband through her intelligence, skill with languages, and ability to recite Persian poetry. Within months, she had her own tent and staff. Within a year, she was advising on trade routes. And within 2 years, poisoned by wife number 3. Historians still argue whether she was truly assassinated by a rival or simply fell ill during a brutal winter. Either way, the story became a cautionary tale about sleeping too close to political ambition and maybe labeling your fermented milk jugs more clearly. Quirky tidbit. In some Mongol clans, wives were assigned yurt duty on a rotational basis. One night, the husband would sleep in wife number one's jur, the next in wife two's, and so on. The schedule could get awkward, especially during travel. More than one nobleman reportedly lost track of whose night it was, leading to minor domestic uprisings and at least one yurt being mysteriously flipped during the night. Allegedly. Of course, not every man had multiple wives. Polygamy was expensive. For most commoners, one spouse was plenty. But among the elite, wives served political, economic, and reproductive functions. And let's be honest, Genghis wasn't conquering empires because he wanted a quiet night in with one person. He was building dynasties, one family tree branch at a time. This meant children, lots of them. And not all were treated equally. The children of the first wife often had greater inheritance rights, though exceptions existed. In the imperial court, maternal rank and political alliances played just as big a role as birth order. Still, love occasionally snuck through the bureaucracy. There are whispers in the historical record of men who favored one wife above the rest, not for status, but for affection. One tale tells of a general who built a second door into his yurt so he could visit his favorite wife secretly without alerting the others. It didn't work. The other wives noticed. They always notice. But even in these tangled marital arrangements, there was an underlying respect for women's labor and intellect. Unlike in many contemporary societies, Mongol women were not cloistered or veiled. They managed flocks, argued trade deals, and even accompanied their husbands to war. One wife famously rode into battle with a baby strapped to her back, wielding a bow. So as you tuck yourself into your yurt tonight, think about the women of the steppe, navigating layered relationships, political rivalries, and rotating yurt calendars with the kind of grace that deserves a lot more historical screen time. Love in the Mongol Empire? Complicated, but always practical and occasionally poetic. You've made it through the politics of marriage and rotating yurt assignments. Congratulations, but don't relax just yet, because tonight it's time to talk about something a little more delicate: virginity. In the Mongol Empire, as in many pre-modern cultures, a woman's virginity at the time of marriage was seen as a marker of family honor, social status, and livestock value. Yes, really. A pure bride was worth more, both in reputation and in tradable assets. That's not romance. That's wool-based accounting. You, unfortunately, are a nervous young bride sitting on the edge of your wedding mat, unsure if the most important people in your life are your parents, or the three old ladies standing outside your tent, ready to help confirm your worth. Enter the purity inspection tradition. Historians still argue whether this practice was universally enforced or more common among aristocratic and high-status families. But many reports, particularly from outside observers like Chinese and Persian chroniclers, describe ceremonies where older women or midwives inspected bedsheets, bodies, or vague atmospheric vibes the morning after the wedding. And if the linens didn't tell the right story, well, someone was getting talked about for years. One particularly grim tale, passed down in folklore, tells of a Mongol bride whose wedding night produced no visible proof. Her grandmother, rather than let her be shamed, secretly added a dab of goat's blood to the linen before anyone else entered. Did it work? Technically. But apparently the goat went missing the next day. Whether that was guilt, superstition, or coincidence, historians remain politely unsure. Let's rewind a little. For young women, protecting one's chastity wasn't just about future husbands. It was also about personal safety, family pride, and clan diplomacy. Girls were taught from an early age how to behave modestly, avoid inappropriate contact, and carry themselves with dignity, though modesty looked very different in the steppe. For instance, it wasn't unusual for women to ride astride like men, wrestle in public, or drink during feasts. Mongol femininity had strength baked into it. Still, flirting had its limits. Crossing the line too early, or even being accused of it, could lead to punishment, forced marriages, or worse. Now, if you're picturing some sort of formal sex education, think again. Young people learned mostly through observation, whispered advice from older siblings, and folk tales, often full of metaphors that made more sense if you were also a sheep farmer. One common saying advised girls to lock their saddle until their horse chose its path. Sounds poetic. Was likely very confusing. Tonight's featured anecdote comes from Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality. which touches on the ways pre-modern societies connected virginity not only with morality, but with the metaphysical. Among the Mongols, purity wasn't just physical, it was seen as a sign of spiritual balance. A woman's essence was unspoiled, clean, and aligned with the sacred order of the cosmos. This belief bled into everything from wedding blessings to health advice. Some healers believed that a woman who lost her virginity outside of marriage would suffer from dream-haunting spirits, infertility, or even clumsiness during cooking. Yes, bad stew could be your reputation unraveling. But Mongol culture also had its contradictions. For example, some clans allowed test marriages, where a young couple lived together before the wedding to see if they were compatible. These trial runs, while not widespread, were recorded in certain regions, especially in Western outposts closer to Turkic or Persian influences. Did they involve intimacy? Likely. Did anyone admit it? Only if it worked out. Quirky tidbit of the night. Goat dung was believed in some circles to be a cure-all, including for unwanted pregnancy. Women boiled it into tea, mixed it with herbs, or rubbed it onto their bellies. Modern medicine, predictably, does not endorse this. But hey, when options are limited and your midwife's main qualification is being loud and over 40, you try what you can. As for men, virginity wasn't usually expected, but sexual restraint was admired. A young warrior who avoided distraction before a campaign was said to ride straighter, shoot better, and dodge arrows with more clarity. Whether this was actual wisdom or just locker room bravado cloaked in shamanistic wisdom is still debated. So here you are, lying under scratchy blankets, trying to remember everything your aunt told you. Don't be too eager. Don't be too shy. Make a little noise so they know you're alive, but not too much, or they'll think you're possessed. Thanks, Auntie. Outside, the wind is howling like a nosy cousin. You can hear muffled voices and the unmistakable clink of a celebration still going. Somewhere nearby, your mother is quietly praying for your fertility. Somewhere else, your new husband is nervously adjusting his boots for no reason. And you just hope the goat wasn't needed for anything important tomorrow. It's early morning on the steppe again. The cold seeps through the seams of the yurt, and your toes feel like small regrets. You stretch beneath a woolen blanket that smells faintly of sheep and last night's stew, trying to ignore the telltale murmurs of your extended family gossiping 5 feet away. But today's different, because today, someone asked you a question you never thought you'd hear. So, do the Mongols have a Kama Sutra? Short answer, not exactly. Long answer, kind of, but not in the way you think. While cultures like ancient India famously produced illustrated manuals on sensual technique, spiritual connection, and the geometry of bedroom yoga, the Mongols took a slightly more, let's say, streamlined approach. You're not likely to find a leather-bound volume of the secret positions of the sacred steppe. Mongol sexuality was deeply practical, unembellished, and largely undocumented, which is odd when you consider how detailed they were in other things. Battle tactics, meticulously recorded. Tax structures, counted down to the last goat. But bedroom habits, not so much. Historians still argue whether this was a deliberate omission, born from cultural modesty, or simply a side effect of oral tradition never making it onto the page. Mongol history, after all, was largely passed down through storytelling, song, and whatever you could remember after 3 cups of fermented mare's milk. What we do know is that Mongols weren't prudes. They didn't cloak sexuality in shame the way some medieval European cultures did. Sex was a part of life, acknowledged, expected, even joked about at feasts. But it wasn't often romanticized or intellectualized. No slow-motion poetry, no lace fans, no scented oils unless they were also used to grease a saddle. But there were some traditions that hint at erotic understanding. Embroidery, for one. While most surviving textiles from the Mongol era are faded or fragmented, a few decorative motifs suggest that some garments, especially wedding robes, featured patterns hinting at fertility and union. Swirling vines, paired animals, lunar symbols, all subtly woven into hems and sleeves. It's possible these were symbolic blessings, or maybe just fancy flair. Scholars continue to debate their meaning, because naturally, no one wrote it down. Tonight's featured example comes from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, which recounts a tale passed down in Central Asian oral lore. A young Mongol bride who embroidered a small, playful animal, a fox, onto her husband's underrobe. When asked why, she simply said, "So the fox is always close when you ride." It may sound innocent, but in context, this was a widely recognized metaphor for cleverness, seduction, and the art of getting what one wants without asking. You sly minx. But aside from occasional wordplay and wedding humor, the Mongol Empire didn't celebrate sexuality in literature or visual art the way ancient Greeks or Indians did. No erotic pottery, no statues with suspiciously suggestive postures, no temples decorated with Kama Sutra scenes. Why? Some scholars suggest it was because the Mongols, as mobile pastoralists, didn't produce much monumental art in general. A traveling people don't carve temples, they pitch tents. Their poetry was about horses and storms, not hearts and loins. And yet in private moments, Mongol couples still had rituals, practices, quiet gestures that might not make it into epic songs, but mattered just the same. Quirky tidbit of the night. Some Mongol couples believed that aligning their bodies toward the east during intimacy, facing the rising sun, would bring health and fertility. Others preferred the west, for reasons lost to time and possibly invented by someone looking for variety. There was even a belief that making love during a thunderstorm could stir the spirits and make future children strong. If nothing else, it covered up the sound of creaky floor mats. Still, Mongol sexuality wasn't entirely practical. There are hints of sensuality buried deep in ritual. During certain festivals, especially those tied to the spring equinox, there were dances and songs that celebrated fertility, abundance, and the renewal of desire. Young people might sneak off during these gatherings, under the pretense of fetching water or collecting firewood. Spoiler, they weren't fetching water. And while the Kama Sutra was never part of the Mongol bookshelf, the core principle remained. Sex was natural, necessary, a shared human rhythm that pulsed even beneath the most brutal war horses. So tonight, as you lay under your wool blanket listening to the creak of the tent poles, remember, even in a culture that didn't draw maps of desire, people still found their way. Maybe not with scrolls and oils, maybe with awkward glances, secret embroidery, and a fox sewn into the lining of your husband's robe. Not bad for a people who carried their homes on their backs. The wind has picked up again. It howls through the grasslands, teasing the flap of your yurt like a nosy neighbor with too much time and not enough sheep. You pull the blanket a little higher up your neck, trying to stay warm and half awake as the fire's last embers glow soft and red in the dark. The cold doesn't sting, it seeps, quiet and certain, like a memory you didn't ask for. You're just starting to drift when someone, your cousin maybe, or that aunt who knows too many stories, leans over and murmurs the name that hushes the whole tent. The cursed princess. The words sit heavy in the air. Her name, depending on who's doing the remembering, was Fatima, or Shirin, or sometimes simply the girl from Khwarazm. No clan ties, no tribe name, just a place and a shadow. She wasn't Mongol, she was captured. Some say she was the daughter of the Khwarazmian Shah, the ruler of a vast Persian Muslim empire that, in the early 13th century, had the terrible misfortune of being both proud and unprepared. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a caravan of trade envoys to open peaceful relations. The Shah, suspicious and perhaps insulted by the audacity, had them executed, then doubled down by killing the Mongol ambassador. Bold move. Terrible decision. The Mongols came for revenge. Not just retaliation, but total erasure. City by city, the Khwarezmian Empire crumbled, and somewhere in the wreckage, behind the walls of Samarkand or Nishapur, no one agrees exactly, was this princess. Accounts differ. Some say she was barely out of girlhood. Others describe her as a poised young woman with almond eyes and a face that made generals forget entire war plans. She was taken, not by a foot soldier, but by someone high-ranking. Jebe, Subutai, maybe even Genghis himself. The name changes with the telling, but the shape of the story stays the same. She became a prize, a spoil, a decoration in a royal tent, a concubine or a forced wife. No one used words like survivor then. The chronicles simply say she was added to the household. From here, the legend splits. In one version, she refused her captor, not with rage, but with silence. She fasted. She braided her hair tight like mourning thread. And after weeks of resistance, she was sent away to live in obscurity, far from court, far from war, far from her name. In another version, she accepted her role, smiled, waited, and began to poison her rivals. They say she used herbs, nothing obvious, just slow sips of bitterness mixed into milk, pinches of roots slipped into soup. One wife fell ill, then another. Rumors flared, servants whispered, and when the general's favorite horse died after eating from her hand, the whole tent turned against her. She was bound, put in a sack, weighted with stones and thrown into the river. Slow, quiet, unnamed. There's no grave, no yurt bearing her memory. Only a story, told in flickering firelight and usually with a warning attached. Don't tempt power if you aren't willing to drown with it. Historians still argue whether she existed at all. Some claim she was a Persian fabrication, a way to explain the brutality of conquest by inventing a heroine. Others believe she was real but erased deliberately, her name too politically inconvenient to preserve. But her story is part of a pattern. For every Mongol woman who gained influence, like Bert or Turgan Khatun, there were dozens, maybe hundreds, whose names were never written. Captured women, exiled daughters, forgotten queens. The Mongol expansion left behind broken cities and broken homes, and in many of those homes were women whose lives changed overnight. That's where tonight's featured anecdote comes in, from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings. She writes of Kulan, another non-Mongol concubine said to have been captured from a Tatar clan. Unlike our cursed princess, Kulan thrived. She became one of Genghis Khan's favorite companions. Her tent stood close to Berte's. She was even allowed to ride alongside the Khan during campaigns, unheard of for most concubines. But power is a fickle blanket. It never warms everyone evenly. When Kulan's son fell ill, other wives blamed her, whispered of spells, accused her of sorcery. Whether Genghis believed them or not, Kulan was quietly relocated to a remote outpost. Not executed, not forgiven, just set aside. A woman who rose too far, too fast, with no allies left standing. Quirky tidbit of the night? Mongol women sometimes carried herb pouches sewn into their garments, not just for scent or healing, but as subtle protective charms. Lavender for dreams, mint for clarity, and wormwood to keep away evil thoughts. Some even believed that wearing a certain knot pattern, braided into the hem of a sleeve, could protect against unwanted advances. Did it work? Who knows? But in a world of war and whispers, every bit of magic helps. You shift beneath your blanket, feeling the weight of centuries settle into your limbs. This is the part of history no one paints on scrolls. The in-between stories, the murmured names, the women remembered only when the wind sounds just right. Somewhere, out beyond the flickering light of your jeer, the stars scatter across the sky like spilled millet. And perhaps one of them is hers. It's midday now on the steppe, and the sky above you stretches wide, an endless bowl of blue so deep it could swallow a continent. You step out of the yurt into that pale, biting sunlight, and the wind slaps you gently in the face with a mix of dried grass, saddle leather, and whatever the horses had for breakfast. You take a breath and realize the Mongol Empire is not known for its cologne game, but it's also not known for shame. Today we're talking fashion. Specifically, how attraction happened in a world where people wore the same coat for a month, bathed only when the shaman said it wouldn't kill them, and considered hasn't been gnawed by mice a valid compliment for winter socks. Mongol clothing was designed not for dazzle, but survival. Your base layer was usually linen or rough cotton if you could afford it, but most people wore wool. Lots of wool. Thick, coarse, and gloriously itchy, layered beneath a deal, the iconic wraparound robe worn by both men and women. The deal was functional. Long sleeves, flared skirts, and fastened diagonally across the chest with toggles. Think of it as a medieval snuggie that could survive a snowstorm and a minor sword fight. And if you wanted to flirt, you cinched that sash just a little tighter. But beyond its practicality, the deal was a quiet canvas for expression. The color, trim, stitching, all said something. Dark blue might suggest age and wisdom. Red hinted at youth or celebration. The wealthier you were, the fancier your seams, some with embroidery so intricate you'd think someone stitched them with a needle made of patience and goat whispers. The real standout, though, the hat. Enter the Malgai, a pointed fur hat with a brim often upturned or folded, sometimes topped with a button or plume. It looked a bit like a wizard hat married a snowshoe. And in the right lighting, it was oddly charming. Hats were important. They signaled social rank, marital status, and whether you'd recently wrestled a raccoon. If someone wore theirs cocked just a little to the left, They might be signaling flirtation or a head cold. One never really knew. Inside the yurt, you notice the scent of something burning. Not firewood, but herbs. Juniper sometimes. Thyme if they were feeling fancy. This was more than aromatherapy. People smoked their clothes over herb bundles to cleanse them, not just of odor, but of bad spirits. As a result, attraction in the Mongol Empire sometimes smelled like a mystical forest with unresolved goat trauma. Here's tonight's featured story from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History. He tells of a Mongol noblewoman famed not for beauty, but for scent. She was known to wear undergarments that had been smoked over mint and cedarwood, kept in a sealed chest until special occasions. One visitor wrote that when she entered a room, the air seemed to hush around her. Whether this was awe, fear, or nasal confusion is unclear, but it left an impression. Historians still argue whether such practices were widespread or elite quirks. Smoked clothing might have been a luxury in poor households, but even there, people found ways to stand out. A carefully chosen sash, a fox-tooth necklace, a piece of bronze shaped like a flower tied into the braid. These little flourishes mattered. In a world of dust and dung, they whispered individuality. Let's talk about grooming. Bathing wasn't frequent, but it wasn't non-existent either. Mongols believed that immersing yourself in water too often could weaken the body's natural balance. But they did wash, especially hands and faces, and used rough cloths and herbal rinses. Teeth, cleaned with twigs and ashes. Hair, combed with carved bone or horn combs, sometimes perfumed with resin from pine trees. Not spa day luxurious, but far from filthy. Now for a quirky tidbit. One traveler's account claims that Mongol men would sometimes rub their armpits with snow and sand before meeting a potential bride. Part exfoliation, part deodorant, and possibly just a test of pain tolerance. Romantic? That depends on your definition. Effective? Historians remain unconvinced. Flirting wasn't verbal. It was visual. A lingering glance during water collection, an offer to help tie a horse's reins, a small cup of rag handed over with two hands. Nothing loud, nothing overt. Just little gestures passed like soft notes under the hum of daily life. And yes, about arag, that bubbly fermented mare's milk with the subtle tang of regret and stomach confusion. While it's an acquired taste, it also served as social glue. Drinking it together was part of courtship, feasts even. Subtle seduction. If someone offers you irog and then a second bowl, one elder whispered, you should not drink the third without asking what else they're offering. That's about as scandalous as Mongol pickup lines got. But under the layers, under the dust, Mongol people still cared about how they presented themselves. They dressed for status, for seasons, for survival, but also for love. A well-stitched deal could say, I respect myself. A neatly braided hairline could whisper, I noticed you. And a clean sash on a festival day, that was practically a proposal. So tonight, as you wrap yourself tighter in your imagined deal, think of the people who once lived and loved here, who didn't have perfumes or fashion magazines or influencers telling them what to wear. They had fur, felt, fire, and just enough time in the smoke to turn practicality into quiet charm. You don't need luxury to be desirable, just warmth, intention, and maybe, just maybe, a really good hat. The wind is softer tonight, less of a howl, more of a sigh. Like the steppe itself has curled up and decided to listen for a while. You sit close to the fire in the yurt, its glow warming your knees as someone tosses a bundle of herbs into the flames. The smoke rises, sweet and slightly bitter. Juniper, mugwort, and something else too, something the shaman won't name. Because tonight, we're talking about spirits, dreams, and those curious Mongol guides between the living and the not so alone, the shamans, and specifically, how shamans dealt with sex. In a world where physical desire was often practical and political, the Mongol approach to the spiritual side of intimacy was more nuanced. Sex wasn't just an act, it was an energy, a force that could attract blessings, stir omens, or accidentally summon something you really didn't want hanging around your yurt at midnight. Let's start simple. The shaman in Mongol society was part healer, part counselor, part supernatural IT support. They handled sickness, settled disputes, performed rituals, and when necessary, explained why your daughter was having strange dreams about that boy from the next camp over. If a young person had recurring erotic dreams, for instance, it wasn't brushed off. The shaman might interpret these dreams as signs of coming fertility, of ancestor messages, or of wandering spirits trying to get involved. Historians still argue whether this was widely believed across all Mongol tribes or more prominent in certain clans with deeper animist traditions. But the evidence is there, in travelogues, oral lore, and ritual remnants. A dream wasn't just a dream. A sexy dream? That was a situation. One case described by a Persian envoy tells of a teenage boy who began shouting names in his sleep and waking up drenched in sweat. The family feared possession. The shaman was called. After a long ceremony involving a bronze mirror, a sheep's shoulder blade, and rhythmic chanting that made half the camp fall asleep, the shaman concluded the boy was being visited by a shuksh, a spirit of a woman who had died unfulfilled. The solution? A symbolic marriage ritual and a vow of celibacy for 2 weeks, which, let's be honest, was probably a record for a 16-year-old with dreams that vivid. Tonight's featured story, drawn loosely from themes in the history of sexuality by Michel Foucault, touches on the intersection of regulation and ritual. Mongol shamans, unlike religious figures in more centralized faiths, didn't impose strict doctrines around sexuality. Instead, they mediated. They looked for balance. If desire disrupted harmony between people, within the body, or among spirits, it had to be addressed. This included fertility rituals. Mongol couples who struggled to conceive might visit a shaman for help. The shaman would trace family lines, consult the stars, or even listen to the bones of a sacrificed animal to determine the blockage. Sometimes the answer was herbs, sometimes fasting, and sometimes a more awkward prescription. You must relocate your sleeping mat. The spirits dislike that corner. Quirky tidbit? Some shamans believe that intimacy during a solar eclipse could cause your child to be born with a loud soul. What that meant exactly, no one could agree on, but it wasn't said with fondness. But shamans didn't just police taboos, they guided rites of passage. Young women might receive ceremonial beads or whispered chants to protect their inner fire. Young men were warned against leaving their energy in strange places, which sounds like a caution against poor decisions and also haunted haystacks. And while we're here, the Mongol view of same-sex desire is tricky to pin down. Written sources are sparse, and most came from outside observers who filtered everything through their own biases. But some steppe folklore suggests a quiet tolerance, if not open acceptance, for non-traditional relationships, especially among those believed to be touched by spirits. In some stories, shamans themselves, who lived between masculine and feminine roles, were seen as sacred, and their relationships, though unusual, were not condemned. Still, boundaries existed. Ritual spaces, particularly sacred tents used for communing with spirits, were often off limits to couples who had just shared a night. Purity, in this sense, was less about shame and more about spiritual clarity. You didn't want ancestral voices showing up while your body was still echoing other conversations. The shaman's job, ultimately, was to keep everything flowing: health, love, energy, the unseen. And that meant treating sex not as sin, but as storm. Sometimes healing, sometimes destructive, but always worth listening to. So tonight, as the fire crackles low and the herb smoke curls around your head like a sleepy ghost, you close your eyes and let your breath settle. Maybe you dreamed something last night. Maybe you'll dream something again. And if it's strange or beautiful or a little too vivid, well, you might want to talk to someone about that in the morning. You wake up groggy, with your face pressed into a woolen mat and the lingering taste of last night's herb smoke still clinging to the back of your throat. Someone's already outside tending to the fire. A pot of broth simmers over the flames. Your neighbor's goat is bleeding with theatrical despair over something deeply personal and probably not very serious. And then you remember today's topic, brothels, or rather, their absence. Because in the vast, dust-laced sprawl of the Mongol Empire, amid its markets and trade routes and military camps, there's one thing you rarely find: a brothel. Not because there wasn't demand. Mongols were people, after all, warm-blooded, wind-chapped, and no strangers to desire. But unlike the bustling red light districts of Tang China or medieval Europe, Mongol culture approached transactional intimacy in a less permanent, more portable way. They didn't build houses for it. They carried it with them. The Mongols were mobile. That's an understatement. Their entire social structure was designed around movement, packing, pitching, shifting camp with the seasons. Why build a fixed pleasure house when everything else in your life came on wheels or hooves? Instead, Mongols developed what one could politely call a roaming romance system. There were women, some willing, some not, who accompanied traveling groups of men, especially merchants and soldiers. These women were often hired for companionship, sometimes for sex, sometimes for household duties. In some cases, all three. Historians still argue whether these arrangements were formalized or more ad hoc. Some sources describe them as wives for hire, women who temporarily joined a man's caravan and were treated, at least publicly, as spouses. Others suggest they were simply unspoken agreements, folded into the blurry space between survival and affection. Tonight's featured anecdote comes from a Persian traveler who wrote of visiting a Mongol camp and observing a market of marriages where women offered themselves as companions for a set period, sometimes a week, sometimes for the length of a journey. Payment could be livestock, tools, clothing, or food. One woman allegedly accepted a goatskin tent and a pot of salted butter as her fee, which honestly sounds pretty fair. What's striking is the tone, not one of scandal or shame, but practicality. These were not brothels, these were arrangements. And Mongol law, while harsh in many ways, had little to say about sex work per se. There were rules about adultery, rules about harming women, and rules about marriage contracts, but very little written legal code about what we would now call prostitution. Quirky tidbit of the night: in some parts of the empire, especially near trade hubs like Karakorum or later capitals in China, foreign-run brothels did pop up, often staffed by Chinese or Central Asian women, but they were seen as foreign institutions. Local Mongols tended to view them with a mix of curiosity and mild disinterest, as if to say, ah, yes, indoor love, very advanced, not for me. So what filled the void? Sometimes festivals. During major seasonal gatherings like Nadam or New Year feasts, young people mingled freely. Drinking, games, and wrestling competitions often led to new matches, temporary flings, or whispered proposals. A well-placed smile, a shared cup of airog, or an offer to help untangle someone's horse line could be all it took. Other times it was more transactional. A soldier in a far-off post might form a temporary bond with a local woman, often through the arrangement of elders or mutual friends. These liaisons could be affectionate, respectful, or deeply unequal, depending on status, culture, and circumstance. One story, shared in Sex with Kings, involves a Mongol general stationed near the Black Sea who formed a years-long partnership with a Greek-speaking healer. She lived in his camp, helped treat wounded soldiers, and was referred to by many as his second wife. But when he was reassigned eastward, he left her behind, gifting her a yurt, 3 sheep, and an apology carved into bone. It wasn't love. It wasn't nothing. These traveling arrangements weren't unique to the Mongols, of course. But the scale, the casualness, the embedded practicality, that was very much part of the steppe ethos. You didn't lock doors here. You didn't settle down unless you had to. And intimacy, like everything else, had to move. That didn't mean it lacked emotion. Sometimes bonds lasted. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes people fell in love and didn't want to say it out loud because that would mean asking someone to stay, and no one likes being the reason a good horse ride is cut short. So tonight, as you stretch out beside your imagined hearth, think of all the quiet arrangements that made this empire work. Not just armies and strategies, but soft deals and shared meals and whispered goodbyes under stars that never moved, even when everything else did. No walls, no velvet cushions, just a tent, a cup, and maybe someone who doesn't mind how loud you snore. The sun has begun to dip low on the horizon, painting the steppe in hues of dusty gold and long, stretched shadows. You're wrapped in your coat now, watching the landscape shift from warm afternoon to chilly dusk. The goats have calmed. The fire is starting to crackle again. And someone just returned from the southern trail with news, gossip, and inevitably opinions about the neighbors. Because if there's one thing the Mongols had besides horses, it was opinions about other cultures. And tonight, we're turning the saddle around to ask, what did everyone else think about them? Specifically, how did the Mongols' sexual customs appear through foreign eyes? The short answer, confusing, sometimes appalling, and occasionally, kind of impressive. Let's start with the Chinese, who had a front row seat to Mongol behavior, especially during the Yuan dynasty, when the Mongols ruled China and everyone had to get used to steppe people doing steppe things right there in the capital. To the Confucian elite who prized decorum, hierarchy, and indoor plumbing, the Mongols were utterly baffling. They drank milk. They wrestled in public. They let women talk back and ride horses. But what scandalized the Chinese gentry most was the openness of Mongol romantic life. No walls, no privacy, women choosing their partners, concubines with opinions. It was too much. One scholar wrote in a letter that the Mongol does not blush to kiss his wife in daylight, nor hesitate to speak of the marriage bed in common company. Whether this was exaggerated or just someone having a bad day, we'll never know. But the sentiment stuck. To the Chinese, Mongol sexuality seemed blunt, egalitarian, and frankly a little chaotic. Now let's turn westward to the Persians and Arabs. The Mongols' conquest hit the Islamic world hard, especially in places like Baghdad. And while initial reactions were understandably focused on warfare, over time, scholars and travelers began writing about Mongol social customs, including sex. Many were appalled, others begrudgingly fascinated. One famous Persian historian, Juvayni, observed that Mongol women ride with strength, speak with boldness, and are not locked behind screens. He seemed both scandalized and a little impressed. These were not veiled, silent wives. They rode into battle. They handled business. They sometimes proposed marriage. Still, there were criticisms. Polygamy was familiar to Islamic culture, but the Mongol application of it, fluid, strategic, and often lacking formal ceremony, was seen as unruly. Mongols didn't always draw hard lines between wives and concubines, and they didn't always marry women from their own religion, which irked clerics trying to make sense of their imperial overlords. Tonight's featured tale comes from a Georgian nun-turned-scribe who witnessed life under Mongol overlordship. She wrote about Mongol envoys arriving with multiple wives in tow, who would unpack tents, cook meals, and occasionally give political advice. One wife, she claimed, translated for her husband during negotiations, then demanded a better tribute in exchange for not flattening your village. The scribe's tone? Half horrified, half thrilled. She spoke as one holding no fear of man or monk, the entry reads. She was wrapped in fox fur and power. Historians still debate the accuracy of this story, but the image stuck. Now let's talk about the Russians. During the Mongol yoke, when Russian principalities were under tribute to the Golden Horde, many chroniclers tried to maintain a moral superiority over their conquerors. Mongol customs were often described as animalistic, pagan, and lustful. And yet, those same chroniclers often describe Mongol family life as surprisingly stable. Husbands respected their wives. Children were taught discipline. Punishments for infidelity could be severe, but not always violent. Some Russian princes, observing the Mongol system, even adopted elements of it in their own courts. And then, of course, there were the Europeans. Medieval Europe had no shortage of spicy things to say about the Mongols. Missionaries like William of Rubruck, who visited the Mongol court in the 1250s, described a world where men may marry many and women may speak too freely. He noted with some discomfort that Mongol women often ran the tents, the trade, and sometimes the marriage negotiations. He also wrote about a strange ceremony in which a man proved his worth by standing shirtless in the snow while his potential bride insulted him creatively. If he flinched, she declined the match. If he smiled, he was invited in for tea. Quirky tidbit of the night? European chroniclers often misunderstood Mongol intimacy rituals, interpreting affectionate greetings or festival dances as orgies. One German monk even claimed Mongols lay together like dogs upon the ground, based solely on seeing people nap in a pile after wrestling. Calm down, Brother Heinz. In truth, Mongol sexuality looked strange to outsiders because it didn't fit into their neat moral categories. It wasn't repressed like in medieval Europe. It wasn't ritualized like in imperial China. It was just lived, practical, open, governed by personal bonds, shamanic advice, and a healthy respect for whoever could boil the best dumplings. So tonight, as the sky turns indigo and the fire warms your ankles, imagine all these foreigners arriving dusty, confused, noses wrinkled, trying to make sense of a people who saw nothing odd in letting love live alongside livestock and who believed a good marriage began with shared chores and ended, hopefully, with enough blankets. And if you ever find yourself in a yurt, offered arag by a woman in a fox fur hat who negotiates trade deals between sips, take the drink, compliment her tent, and don't interrupt her while she's talking. She probably has better things to do than explain why you're wrong. The moon is high now, and the yurt has settled into a sleepy rhythm. Someone's snoring near the back, probably Uncle Ganbold, and you're wrapped in a blanket, watching smoke curl through the roof vent as the fire crackles low. It's the quiet hour, when stories grow weirder, when questions rise no one dares ask in daylight. And tonight's question is a doozy. Let's talk about the rumor. The one you might have heard whispered in a medieval monastery, scribbled in the margins of a crusader's journal, or shared in the hushed backrooms of a 13th century tavern. Were the Mongols lovers of horses? Not emotionally. We're talking biblically. It's the kind of accusation that makes historians cringe and teenagers snicker. And yes, we're going there, but not for cheap laughs, because this rumor, while absurd, opens up a very real discussion about propaganda, cultural misunderstanding, and the strange ways sexuality has been used as a weapon of war. So where did it come from? Europe, of course. In the wake of Mongol invasions across Eastern Europe and the Islamic world, a flood of misinformation surged westward. Monks, merchants, and minor nobles all rushed to describe this terrifying, barely understood people who rode out of the east like smoke and thunder. And when people fear something, they often reach for the most shocking insults they can think of. To European chroniclers, the Mongols were already monstrous, tattooed, meat-eating, sky-worshipping horse archers who didn't attend church and bathed in milk. The next logical, to them, accusation? That they blurred the sacred boundary between rider and steed. One particular chronicle from a Polish bishop's scribe described the Mongols as beast-like in their affections, not knowing shame even with the animals that carry them. Another claimed Mongol soldiers took pleasure in the mare's company on lonely nights. Was there evidence? Absolutely not. Did it stop the rumors? Also absolutely not. This wasn't new either. Accusing outsiders of bestiality had long been a tool of dehumanization. Romans accused Carthaginians of it. Medieval Christians said it about Muslims. It was a way to strip people of dignity, to paint them as closer to beasts than men. But what makes this story stickier is the Mongols' actual relationship with horses, which was deeply intimate. They rode, milked, slept beside, and occasionally bled their horses to drink the blood in times of famine. They used mare's milk for everything from alcohol to baby formula. Horses weren't just transportation, they were survival. And that closeness made outsiders uncomfortable. So they took it too far. Here's your featured anecdote of the night. In Sex with Kings, Eleanor Herman mentions the court of a European queen where a Mongol emissary was once offered a stallion as a gift. He reportedly declined, saying, "You may keep the animal, for I do not wish to marry it." This, apparently, was considered scandalously witty at the time and was repeated enough to become folklore. Whether he said it or not, we'll never know. But it reveals how conscious the Mongols were of these rumors and how they sometimes leaned into sarcasm to deflect them. Now for a quirky tidbit. Mongol folklore actually included tales of shape-shifting horses. One such tale speaks of a young herder who fell in love with a girl who could become a mare under moonlight. The moral was unclear, possibly something about not trusting girls who gallop, but it shows that horses, for the Mongols, lived in both the real and the mythic. Historians still argue how widespread these rumors were within Mongol territory. It's likely most Mongols never heard them, but among enemies and conquered peoples, the image of the Mongol beast was useful. It justified resistance, it explained loss, it made a complex people into caricatures. And yet, if you asked an actual Mongol about love, they'd probably talk about duty, loyalty, the comfort of sleeping beside someone who could shoot as well as you. Maybe they'd mention Berta, the first wife of Genghis Khan, who stood by him through exile, war, and betrayal. Or Kulan, who rode into battle with a bow and baby on her back. They wouldn't mention horses, except to say, "That's my fastest one. Don't touch it." The saddest part, these rumors outlived the empire. Even centuries later, as Mongol power waned and new dynasties rose, the myth of the barbarian persisted, repeated in paintings, literature, and lectures long after the truth was lost in the dust. So tonight, as you nestle deeper into your imagined yurt, listen to the gentle stomp of hooves just outside. The horses are resting too, blanketed, fed, watched over. You smile, knowing the truth. The Mongols didn't make love to their horses, but they did love them, with respect, with reverence, with that deep, wordless trust that only grows when two creatures survive 100 winters together. It's not scandal, it's loyalty. And that's something even the cruelest rumor can't erase. It's deep night now. The camp is quiet, except for the occasional grunt from a sleeping ox and the low groan of stretched leather as the wind tugs at the edge of your yurt. You shift in your blanket, eyes half-lidded, warmth creeping in. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a woman is in labor. Because tonight, we ride into a different kind of battlefield. Pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum recovery in the Mongol Empire were not gentle affairs. Then again, neither was anything else. Let's start with the basics. Being pregnant on the step meant being pregnant on the move. There was no maternity leave, no quiet nurseries with pastel walls and lullabies. There were horses, there were carts, there were cold nights, open fires, and the unrelenting expectation that you would keep up with the herd, even with a baby growing beneath your ribs. Most women gave birth in their family's yurt or in a smaller side tent prepared for the occasion. Privacy was minimal. Help came in the form of mothers, sisters, or the old woman who had seen enough births to predict the outcome by the sound of the first scream. There were no professional midwives in the formal sense, but there were birth-experienced aunties, which, let's be honest, may be even more effective. These women knew the rhythms of labor. They rubbed the belly with sheep fat, whispered protective chants, and monitored the fire like it owed them rent. Tonight's featured story comes from a Central Asian folktale, later recorded in Persian chronicles, about a Mongol woman named Altani, who gave birth to twins on horseback while fleeing a skirmish. The story goes that she didn't dismount, didn't stop, and wrapped the babies in her deal as she rode. Whether it's fact or legend, the tale became a symbol of Mongol strength. Altani's children were later said to become commanders, though one always limped slightly because his mother blinked at the wrong moment. Historians still argue whether such stories were exaggerated or rooted in truth. But even conservative estimates confirm that Mongol women were astonishingly resilient. And they had to be. The empire moved fast. It didn't pause for contractions. Pregnancy was seen as a blessing, but also a duty. A woman's ability to produce heirs, warriors, and workers was essential to clan survival. Fertility was celebrated, and the birth of a son, especially to a noble wife, could shift alliances, inheritance, and entire fates. But birthing a child wasn't a guarantee of safety. Without modern medicine, complications were frequent, and postpartum infection was a deadly risk. Mongol women relied on herbal remedies, including boiled willow bark for pain, crushed mint and garlic for infection, and an alarming number of things involving sheep dung and river stones. One recipe suggests wrapping the afterbirth in linen and burying it under the yurt entrance to anchor the baby's soul. Quirky tidbit? Mongol tradition sometimes called for naming a baby after a strong animal, like wolf or falcon, if the labor had been difficult. This was thought to scare off evil spirits who might try to return and bother a weak-sounding infant. There are records of children named things like Bone Breaker or Never Stop, which makes roll call sound like a fantasy novel. And the postpartum period? Rest, but not too much. New mothers were expected to recover quickly, not because anyone was cruel, but because life didn't allow for prolonged stillness. Herds had to be tended, meals had to be cooked. Children didn't stop needing things just because you were still bleeding. Yet there were moments of tenderness. Mothers would sleep skin to skin with their newborns under thick woolen wraps. Fathers, yes, even rough-faced warriors, would craft tiny charms from bone or copper to hang above the cradle. Songs were sung, soft and strange, passed down from one generation of women to the next, often sung without fully knowing their origin. One line from a lullaby recorded near Lake Baikal goes, "Sleep, little hoofprint, dream of clouds. Your mother's milk is warm as spring. Your father rides the night to guard you." Romanticized? Maybe. But it paints a picture of a people who, despite the roughness of their world, still made room for softness. And what about contraception? There were attempts. Some women drank herbal teas brewed from tansy or wormwood, believed to prevent pregnancy if consumed regularly. Others used charms, abstained on certain moon phases, or relied on spacing through breastfeeding, called natural child distancing, though it's unclear how effective it was when people were routinely interrupted by goat emergencies. Abortion? Rarely discussed in Mongol records, though some Chinese observers mention herbal infusions used to bring balance when a woman's cycle had stopped unexpectedly. Whether this was intentional termination or miscarriage management is still debated. And then there were the spiritual safeguards. A shaman might be called to read the unborn child's aura. A belt made from deer hide could be tied around the mother's waist to ward off ill spirits. Women were discouraged from sitting in the northeast corner of the yurt, believed to be where the wind spirits entered, and from watching thunderstorms while pregnant, lest their child be born with too much sky. It wasn't science, but it was care. So tonight, as you lie still and breathe deeper, imagine those mothers, strong-backed, thick-voiced, laughter-lined, swaying with their babies under the same stars that shine above you now. They didn't have epidurals, they didn't have books or monitors or soft white beds, but they had hands, heat, hope, and they had each other. The fire has dimmed to a soft orange glow, flickering low along the edges of the yurt. Someone rolls over in their sleep, sighs, and falls still again. Outside, the wind combs gently through the tall grass, and somewhere in the distance, a horse snorts at nothing in particular. You lie still, eyes heavy, thinking about love, not the warm, fuzzy kind, but the kind that goes wrong. Because tonight, we're talking about infidelity. What happened when someone stepped outside the boundaries of marriage in the Mongol Empire? What if a husband strayed? Or a wife? Did jealous rage erupt? Did yurts burn? Did someone get turned into stew? Sometimes, but more often, it was complicated. Let's start with context. Mongol marriages, especially among the common people, were based more on alliance and function than passionate monogamy. A man might have multiple wives, a woman might remarry if widowed. Emotional exclusivity wasn't always expected. What mattered more was respect, order, and not making a mess of things. But that doesn't mean cheating was fine, especially for women. Among the Mongols, adultery was considered a breach of both trust and clan honor. For women, being caught in an affair could have serious consequences: social exile, divorce, or worse. The Yasa, the great legal code attributed to Genghis Khan, reportedly prescribed death for adultery in some cases, particularly if it involved noble families and risked confusing inheritance. For men, the situation was a bit more forgiving, surprise, but not consequence-free. A man who slept with another man's wife without permission could be punished, especially if the woman belonged to someone powerful. At the very least, he might be fined livestock. At the worst, he could end up missing an ear. Historians still argue how strictly these laws were enforced. Some believe the Mongols were pragmatic about infidelity, so long as it didn't cause a scandal or produce illegitimate heirs. Others suggest certain clans were more conservative, especially in the later generations, influenced by Islamic or Confucian values. Tonight's featured story comes from a Chinese envoy who visited a Mongol noble household in the 1270s. He wrote about a young wife who was suspected of sneaking out at night to meet a traveling archer. Rather than confront her directly, the husband simply moved the yurt, packed it up, left her behind, and set up camp 4 miles east. No fighting, no yelling, just goodbye. She followed, on foot, in winter. He took her back, but not without making her sleep in a separate jur for 7 weeks. To cleanse the wind, he said. Forgiveness in the steppe came slowly, often bundled in silence in a long, awkward journey. But not all betrayals were met with restraint. Another tale, this one passed down through steppe folklore, tells of a jealous wife who suspected her husband of sneaking off to visit a younger concubine. One night, she waited until he fell asleep, quietly cut a slit in his boot soles, and filled them with soft dung. When he rose at dawn to prepare for his journey, he slid his feet in, frowned, and then spent the next 2 hours muttering about betrayal while trying to scrub them clean. Did it fix their marriage? Probably not, but it became a legendary example of what you could do without spilling blood. Quirky tidbit: some Mongol women were known to braid warning knots into their husbands' sleeves before a long journey. These knots were symbols of loyalty, But if they returned undone, it was taken as a sign of wandering hands. Was this superstition? Absolutely. Did it stop anyone? Not really, but it gave people something to fight about, which in a marriage is tradition. And what of the legal route? Mongol women had more legal rights than many of their contemporaries. They could initiate divorce, reclaim their dowry, and even take custody of children. If a wife accused her husband of infidelity, especially if it involved neglect or mistreatment, she could petition for separation. Some simply left, returned to their natal clan, and started again. Men, too, could divorce. And in the Golden Horde regions of Russia and Central Asia, local courts often dealt with adultery cases using fines, witness testimony, and strongly worded toasts during public feasts. That's right. Sometimes shame was served with soup. Public dishonor was often more powerful than legal punishment. If you were caught cheating and became the subject of gossip, your clan might disown you. Allies might withhold trade. You could find yourself with fewer marriage prospects and a permanent label as someone whose tent flap swings too freely. Still, not all affairs ended badly. There are whispered tales of secret lovers who defied expectation, left their clans behind, and started lives together far from judgment. One story, told by an old herder near the Altai Mountains, tells of a woman who fell for a storyteller from a rival tribe. They met under the guise of trading yarn. Eventually, they fled east together, changing names and identities, leaving behind families who'd rather pretend they were dead than admit they'd eloped. Were they happy? The story ends with a child who laughed like thunder. We'll take that as a yes. So tonight, as you lie in your imaginary yurt, think of those long, silent days after betrayal, of the woman boiling milk tea with shaking hands, of the man carving a new saddle to avoid saying what he really feels, of the lovers who dared and the ones who didn't. Infidelity in the Mongol world wasn't just about broken hearts, it was about space, the space between tents, the space left empty after someone's gone, the space you don't talk about but always feel. The step at night is not silent, it breathes. You lie still in your blanket, the thick wool pressing lightly against your chest, and outside your yurt, the wind moves like something old remembering its way home. It slips between the seams of felt and bone, curling around your ankles with cool fingers. The fire is down to embers now, glowing like the eyes of a dozing cat. Everyone else seems to be asleep, or at least pretending. But you know what happens in this hour. This is when the old stories wake up, not the ones about war or glory, not the grand tales of Genghis or empire. These are the other stories, the ones whispered under thick blankets, told in the hush of women's tents, or around embers too small to cast shadows. The stories about what happens when desire dances too long with the dark. Because for the Mongols, sex wasn't just physical, it was spiritual, wild, mysterious, and sometimes dangerous. One of the oldest cautionary tales still told on the steppe is known simply as the girl who flirted under the wrong moon. She was young, clever, full of songs and jokes, and maybe a little too confident in the way she tossed her braid. One night, she met a stranger, handsome, smiling, mysterious. He came to her tent just after midnight and whispered that the stars had guided him. She believed him because she wanted to, but when she awoke, he was gone. And so was her reflection. From that day forward, every surface, bronze mirror, still water, polished bone, refused to show her face. Her grandmother claimed she had flirted with a moon ghost, a spirit that wandered between tents, drawn to unguarded hearts. The only cure? To speak the truth aloud before the next full moon, or be forgotten by her own self. Did it really happen? Hard to say. But ever since then, elders have warned, never kiss anyone whose shadow looks unsure. Historians still argue about the origins of such tales. Were they moral warnings wrapped in metaphor? Ways to regulate behavior before there were written rules? Or simply old truths retold until they blurred into myth? It's likely all three, but the impact was real. Sexual folklore was a kind of invisible social structure. Whispered boundaries, soft rules passed through generations, sometimes with a wink, sometimes with a shiver. It wasn't written in the Yasata, but everyone knew the terms. Take the legend of the Night Stitcher, a spirit woman who appeared to men who bragged too much about their conquests. She'd arrive just before dawn, beautiful and kind, and offer to mend their clothing. Grateful, the man would fall asleep while she worked. When he woke, his garments were neatly repaired, but stitched shut at the hips. Quirky? Yes. Terrifying if you were planning on impressing someone that morning? Also yes. Or consider the story of the 3 knots. This was a superstition among some Mongol families where mothers would tie 3 secret knots into their daughter's robe the night before a festival. If a boy tried to undo the robe and found the knots, he was supposed to leave her alone. If he untied all 3 without her noticing, well, some say she'd fall in love. Others say she'd fall under a spell. The knots were both literal and symbolic, tests of consent, protection charms, and subtle power, all wrapped in wool. And not all stories were warnings. Some were oddly tender. There's a folk song still sung in parts of Inner Mongolia about 2 young women from rival clans who met each year during the midsummer horse races. They never spoke, they never touched, but every year they braided 1 ribbon from each other's deal into their hair and rode together for a few moments across the open plain. The final verse of the song ends, "They did not kiss, they did not stay, but the wind knew what they meant." Stories like this were ways to speak about longing, about what couldn't be done openly, especially in communities where conformity mattered. They made space for feelings that had no other safe home. Featured tonight from Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's mention of a Mongol elder who once said, "A good tale is like a blanket. It doesn't matter if it's true, as long as it keeps you warm." He was referencing a particularly odd story about a girl who fell in love with a deer spirit. The tale shifts with each telling. Sometimes she becomes a deer too, sometimes she waits forever. But in every version, someone watches her disappear into the mist, laughing. And while modern historians scratch their heads, Mongol grandmothers just nod. Because they know, not everything needs to make sense to be remembered. Even in war-torn, yurt-crowded, horse-scented daily life, people needed stories. Stories to explain the unexplainable, to make sense of dreams, to keep the curious from walking too far into the dark after sunset. Quirky tidbit of the night? Mongol children were sometimes told that if they had an especially vivid dream involving kissing or naked wrestling, they had to tell their grandmother before sunrise. If they didn't, the dream might stick to their back and follow them forever, causing them to blush at random times, stammer during important conversations, or lose every wrestling match for 3 years. Was it magic or just grandmotherly genius at keeping secrets out of the yurt? Either way, it worked. So tonight, as your own eyelids begin to lower and your blanket folds itself tighter around your shoulders, remember that the steppe has always been full of stories. Stories to explain things and to protect us from the things that don't need explaining. Sleep gently now. The wind is quieter when it listens. The morning comes cold and quiet. You stir slowly, the kind of slow that only comes after dreaming of things you probably shouldn't talk about at breakfast. The camp is already in motion, horses being saddled, arrows checked, dried meat packed into satchels, the clink of stirrups, the creak of leather. It's campaign season again, because tonight we follow the Mongol army into the field, not for battle, but for what came between battles. What happened when an empire on horseback found itself with months of open steppe, no privacy, and far too many hormones? Welcome to the awkward, dusty world of battlefield lust and its aftermath. Let's be clear, the Mongol military was not a weekend hobby. These were full-scale campaigns lasting months, sometimes years. The army was a well-oiled, terrifyingly efficient machine, built on strict discipline and supernatural endurance. Soldiers traveled fast, lived light, and could go days without cooked food, sleep, or even fire. What they did not travel with? Spouses. Not usually. So imagine, you're 20, healthy, half drunk on adrenaline and fermented milk, and sleeping under the stars with thousands of equally unwashed, occasionally charming comrades. Something's bound to happen. But the Mongols didn't just let desire run wild. Genghis Khan, ever the practical strategist, knew that a distracted army was a weak one. His legal code, the Yasa, included explicit rules about sexual behavior during military campaigns. Historians still debate how strictly those rules were enforced, but one account describes a general who banned kissing, fondling, or poem writing in the ranks. Any soldier caught sneaking off for a tryst was forced to clean horse hooves for a week. One poor soul caught composing a love note instead of polishing arrows had to carry water buckets with his teeth for 3 days. That's one way to kill the mood, and yet the desire didn't disappear, it just got redirected. Many soldiers formed tent friendships, platonic or not so platonic bonds that offered comfort and intimacy during long stretches of hardship. Shared blankets, inside jokes, the occasional back massage disguised as a wrestling warm-up. Some were fleeting, others became lifelong alliances that outlasted the battlefield. Quirky tidbit, there's a record of one Mongol unit that developed a tradition of braid bonding. Before a dangerous mission, pairs of soldiers would tie a small lock of each other's hair together, sometimes behind the ear, sometimes at the wrist. It was a way of saying, I'll come back, and if I don't, remember me with this knot. Were these bonds romantic? Sometimes. Sexual? Possibly. But the Mongol military, while not openly tolerant of same-sex relationships, also didn't obsess over them the way European armies did. As long as it didn't disrupt discipline or inheritance lines, most commanders turned a blind eye. Featured tonight from Eleanor Herman's Sex with Kings, there's the story of a Mongol captain who kept a small portrait of his wife stitched into the inside of his armor. Before battle, he'd press his forehead to it and whisper, "Don't wait up." He was known for refusing all other companionship and earned the nickname Iron Wife Husband, which sounds weird until you realize it was said with deep respect. After he died, the painting was placed on his saddle and paraded for 3 days, his comrades saluting as if she were a general herself. But not everyone abstained. In some campaigns, particularly in enemy territory, local women were taken as captives or concubines. It's an ugly truth, and no storytelling can soften it. Despite Genghis's laws forbidding rape, the chaos of war made enforcement inconsistent. Some commanders kept mistresses, others offered comfort women as rewards to troops. And when these liaisons resulted in children, things got complicated. Some offspring were absorbed into the Mongol household, others were abandoned or given to wet nurses, and in rare cases, they were raised as future warriors. Blood didn't always equal legitimacy, but in an empire obsessed with lineage, it mattered. One tragic tale tells of a woman from a captured city who bore a child by a high-ranking officer. The child was kept, she was not. Her name is lost, but the son became a military advisor in the Western campaigns. His birth was mentioned in royal chronicles, hers, never again. Then there were the soldiers who tried not to engage, but failed anyway. Imagine being a teenage archer, just promoted, sharing a tent with a war hero who smells like confidence and burnt lamb. You try to focus on drills, on posture, on not blushing every time he hands you your bow. But desire, as it turns out, is more persistent than enemy archers. Many Mongol poems survive that hint at battlefield longing, not always about women. Lines like, "When the moon rose, I saw his shoulders, not the stars," or "I shared his saddle and forgot my fear." Were these metaphors? Maybe. Were they subtle confessions written between blood and boredom? Very likely. Still, discipline reigned. Even with passion simmering beneath the armor, the Mongol army rarely broke rank. That's what made them unstoppable. Desire was acknowledged, but never allowed to lead. You could love, you could ache, but you had to march. And when the campaign ended, the awkward aftermath. Men returned home. Some brought lovers. Others returned to spouses who had questions. More than one divorce started with a too-long hug from a stranger outside the yurt. But some reunions were tender. Soldiers who hadn't held a lover in months would sit quietly by the fire, tracing old calluses and listening to their children snore. So tonight, as you stretch out beside the fire in your imaginary gerr, remember the quiet hunger of men on the march, the ones who sang to themselves in the dark, who carved hearts into arrow shafts, who waited, who didn't. The battlefield was never just war, it was loneliness, and sometimes love. The fire in the center of your yurt has burned down to gentle embers. The wind has grown still, like it too is waiting for the next story. You lie in the warmth of the felt-walled world around you, heavy with sleep when someone stirs beside the coals and begins to speak softly, not loudly, never hurried. They say, "Do you want to hear about the woman who ruled an empire?" Because she did. Not in secret, not from the shadows, but boldly, from the very heart of Mongol power. Her name was Teregina Khatun, and for a handful of remarkable years in the 13th century, she held the reins of the largest land empire the world had ever seen. But you don't see her on the statues. No bronze horses bear her name. The scrolls rarely mention her beyond the margins. Still she ruled. Let's step back for a moment. Temüjin was one of the principal wives of Genghis Khan, the son of Genghis Khan and his chosen successor. As the great Khan, Genghis led campaigns across Eurasia, expanded the empire's bureaucracy, and drank just enough arag to worry every advisor in a 100-mile radius. Temüjin, meanwhile, waited, observed, advised, and slowly built her own network, one not made of soldiers and arrows, but of scribes, diplomats, and quiet loyalty. Then Genghis died in 1241. That death left a power vacuum in the empire, and in Mongol tradition, no new great Khan could be chosen without a grand assembly of nobles, a kurultai. But kurultais took time, and while the world waited, someone had to govern. Temüjin stepped forward, and not just to keep the seat warm, she acted decisively, removed Genghis' key ministers, replaced them with her own loyal allies. She summoned diplomats, struck deals, even paused military campaigns to stabilize the empire from within, all while preparing her son, Gyuk, to succeed his father. And she did all this as a woman. Now, this wasn't entirely unprecedented in Mongol culture. Steppe women enjoyed more rights than in most medieval societies. They owned property, managed households, even rode into battle when needed. But to rule the empire directly and without apology, that was rare, and Temüjin wasn't doing it quietly. She corresponded with foreign leaders, issued imperial edicts with her own seal. She hosted emissaries and held court in her own tent, flanked not by male generals, but by an inner circle of advisors, many of whom were women. At the center of that circle was a Persian woman named Fatima. And here is where the story takes a quieter, more complicated turn. Fatima had originally been captured and enslaved, but she rose swiftly in Temüjin's household, not as a servant, but as something else. A trusted confidante, a political strategist, and possibly more. Contemporary sources, some Mongol, some Persian, some bitterly hostile, describe Fatima as seductive, clever, and dangerous. She advised on court appointments, financial decisions, and the flow of imperial gifts. Some nobles accused her of black magic. Others whispered that she shared Temüjin's bed. Historians still argue whether Fatima and Temüjin were lovers, or whether the accusation was just a tool used by enemies to discredit two powerful women. But the closeness between them was real. Fatima spoke for Temüjin, acted in her name, and clearly rattled the male courtiers who found themselves answering to two women in robes rather than a man in armor. That, as you can imagine, didn't go over well. Temüjin ruled for nearly 5 years, longer than many regents in Mongol history. She maneuvered carefully but firmly, all while preparing the stage for her son's rise. And in 1246, the kurultai was finally held. Genghis Khan, her chosen heir, was crowned. You'd think that would have secured her legacy. But power, once granted, rarely stays quiet. Gyuk never forgave his mother for overshadowing him. Almost immediately after his coronation, he dismissed her ministers. Then he targeted Fatima. She was arrested, interrogated under torture, and, according to Persian records, executed. Her body, they say, was thrown into the river, erased. Temüjin died shortly after. Some say from illness, others from grief. Either way, her story ends not with a blaze of glory, but with silence. Her name slowly faded from the official records, her influence airbrushed from history like smoke from the roof hole of a yurt. Quirky tidbit? A legend from the Golden Horde tells of a woman who once ruled the sky, not as a goddess, but as a general's widow, cloaked in stars. She walked with no army, but the wind changed at her voice. Many now believe that was Temüjin, transformed by memory into myth. Was she perfect? Hardly. She made enemies, played politics, protected her power fiercely, but she also ruled with skill, and possibly with love. If Fatima was truly her lover, then theirs was a bond forged not in softness, but in survival, a relationship built on shared ambition and mutual trust in a world that distrusted both. Even if their love remained speculation, it existed in whispers loud enough to shake empires. So tonight, as you lie in your imagined yurt, wrapped in the quiet of sleeping goats and fading embers, think of Temüjin Khatun, not as a shadowy figure behind a famous man, but as a woman who stood alone in the cold wind of history and did not flinch. She ruled, and maybe, just maybe, she loved. The stars are fading now, gently drowned by the hint of a coming dawn. The night has curled up like a tired wolf. But before the steppe breathes in its first full light, we step into one last shadowy space of the Mongol Empire. Not a palace, not a battlefield, but something in between, a punishment tent. You see, for all their legendary freedoms and flexible social norms, the Mongols still had rules, especially when it came to sex. And breaking those rules? Well, that could land you somewhere very cold, very quiet, and very alone. Welcome to the world of punishment for sexual transgressions, an awkward, uncomfortable, and sometimes strangely humorous corner of history. Let's start with the big one, adultery. Among the Mongols, sexual misconduct wasn't necessarily a sin, but it was a social disruption. The yasa, the empire's legal code, was clear. Adultery with someone else's spouse could destabilize families, upset political alliances, and worst of all, confuse inheritance lines. If a child's parentage was uncertain, it could threaten entire bloodlines. So yes, it was taken seriously. For commoners, punishments varied. A first offense might mean a stiff fine, livestock, labor, or public apology. A second offense could mean banishment from the clan, or being forced to live on the edge of the camp for a season. There are even records of adulterers being forced to wear backwards clothing or to serve meals barefoot for a year, a kind of step version of public shaming. But for nobles, let's just say things got colder. Featured tonight from Michel Foucault's The History of Sexuality, there's a reference to what was known politely as temporary exile to a silent tent. This wasn't just isolation, it was theater. The guilty party, often male, would be sent to live in a specially designated tent, usually pitched just far enough from the main camp that their presence could still be seen, but not heard. They weren't allowed to speak or be spoken to. Meals were delivered by children or elders who were considered neutral in clan drama. No one else could visit, touch, or acknowledge them for the duration of their sentence, which ranged from one moon cycle to a full season. Historians still argue whether this punishment was more symbolic than practical. Some scholars suggest it was a psychological tactic designed to make the individual feel erased without resorting to physical harm. Others think it served as a cooling off period, both literal and emotional, for situations that could have escalated to violence. Either way, it worked. There's a Mongol proverb still used in parts of the steppe today. Speak not to the tent with one window. It means, don't interfere in someone else's mess. Now let's not pretend the punishment was always fair. Women caught in illicit affairs faced far harsher judgment. A noblewoman suspected of infidelity could lose her status, her household, or her children. Some were sent back to their natal clan in disgrace. Others were quietly married off to distant outposts, as if exile through wedlock was the solution. But not all punishments were cruel. Sometimes they were just weird. Quirky tidbit? There's a tale from a traveling Armenian monk who claimed that a Mongol commander once punished a junior officer for propositioning 7 different women in 1 week. The punishment? He was required to spend 7 days alone with 7 goats, not for anything untoward, just to test whether he truly preferred constant company. At the end of the week, the man reportedly declared, "I never wish to hear another bleat again." And everyone laughed, including the goats. Whether that story is true or not, it reflects a Mongol truth. Shame could be dished out through absurdity as well as austerity. You didn't always need blood to make a point. Sometimes embarrassment did the job. Of course, not all sexual missteps were about relationships. Some involved public behavior, acts considered too brazen, too loud, too festival adjacent. One ancient song tells of 2 young lovers caught in an embrace during the midsummer wrestling games. Rather than punish them with exile or marriage, the local Khotun decreed that they must sit side by side at every public feast that year, holding hands, while an old woman sang their love ballad in a voice like boiling milk. The song contained every detail, and by the 5th feast, they were begging for silence. Again, psychological warfare, steppe style. But the rules weren't just about punishment. They were about protecting harmony. A yurt is small. A camp is communal. When someone's behavior threatened the group's emotional balance, consequences weren't about moral judgment. They were about restoring the peace. Still, the line between protective custom and harsh overreaction was thin. One story, more tragic than funny, tells of a woman named Sariga who fell in love with her cousin's husband. When discovered, she confessed publicly and asked to be exiled rather than force a divorce. The clan agreed. She rode north alone with one pack horse in a tent. But years later, traders passing through that region claimed they were greeted by a smiling woman who brewed the best tea in the region and told stories of forbidden love as if they were someone else's. They called her the Ghost of the Wind Pass, and she always warned, if you love in the wrong season, learn to love the cold. So tonight, as you stretch out beneath your imaginary felt roof, warmed by the breath of ancient embers, think about the soft justice of the steppe, the silence that taught lessons, the shame that healed, the goat-based punishments that made you think twice. Because in the Mongol Empire, sex was not taboo, but it was communal. And when the yurt gets too noisy, someone's got to step outside. The final embers are giving in now, crumbling into soft, glowing dust. Outside, the wind has quieted into that barely there kind of silence that only comes before sunrise. The horses are still. The sheep are still. You are still. And we've arrived at the last fireside chapter of the night. It's time to talk about what the Mongols left behind, not just in bloodlines and cities, but in how people thought about sex, love, and control. Because when the empire finally began to fade, it didn't just vanish, it morphed, it left fingerprints. And so tonight we wrap up with the legacy of Mongol sexuality, what endured, what didn't, and how it quietly echoes in the far corners of modern life. Let's begin with a strange truth. The Mongols, despite their fearsome image, were not Puritans. They didn't build institutions to shame desire. They didn't erect statues to chastity. They saw sex as part of life. Messy, loud, awkward sometimes, but not unclean, not unspoken. And when they ruled, that attitude shaped entire regions. During the height of the Mongol Empire, cross-cultural contact exploded. Routes like the Silk Road didn't just carry spices and silk, they carried ideas. A Mongol general might learn about Indian love poetry. A Persian courtier might adopt steppe attitudes about female property rights. A Chinese scholar might rethink Confucian rules on gender roles after meeting a Mongol noblewoman who could ride better than he could write. One direct impact? The relative freedom of women in certain parts of Central Asia persisted long after the Mongol Empire faded. In regions once ruled by khatuns and female regents, daughters inherited land, widows remarried on their own terms, and a woman who rode bareback wasn't an anomaly, she was a continuation. Historians still argue how long these freedoms lasted. Some say the rise of Islam in certain khanates eventually reimposed patriarchal norms. Others argue Mongol influence helped blend traditional gender roles into something more flexible, more adaptable, especially in Turkic and Siberian cultures. And what about sexual customs? Well, here's a quirky tidbit. There's evidence that a few Mongol-era marriage traditions survived in secret in the songs, dances, and dowry customs of remote villages across Kazakhstan, Mongolia, and parts of western China. One wedding song, still sung today, includes a verse about a bride whispering her desires into the wind, echoing the old belief that the wind would carry private hopes where no gossip could reach. You probably won't hear that one on the radio, but some legacies were lost, buried under newer empires, new religions, new moral codes. Over time, the earthy, grounded, human approach to intimacy that once flowed through the steppe became tidied up, sanitized. The silkiness of old courtship became stiff with etiquette. The laughter of yurt-side romance was replaced by sealed marriages and silence. Even the stories changed. The tales once told around the fire, about moon spirits, dream lovers, and tent-side trysts, began to vanish. They weren't written down. They didn't survive the monasteries. But if you visit a grandmother in the Orkhon Valley, and she likes you, and the weather is right, she might still tell you the one about the warrior who followed a woman's voice into the hills and never came back, because she says with a wink, he didn't want to. And that's a legacy. Not a law, not a policy, not a war, but a feeling, a remembered permission to want, to choose, to laugh about it later. Featured tonight in Peter Webb's The Erotic Spirit Through History, there's a beautiful observation that for the Mongols, intimacy was never just an act, it was part of their worldview. The body was not something to conquer or deny. It was a tool, a temple, a campfire of its own. Pleasure was not shameful. Love was not rare. And desire was not always polite, but it was honest. Which brings us to Genghis Khan. Yes, he had many wives. Yes, he fathered many children. But maybe his true legacy wasn't in his seed count. It was in how he built a society that allowed passion to exist alongside power, where love could be a weapon, a bomb, or a rope tying two tents together through the wind. So as you lie still now, nearly asleep, wrapped in all these strange, beautiful stories from long ago, consider the lessons left behind. That intimacy doesn't need perfect conditions. That love can survive yurt smoke, war drums, and winter. That even the fiercest empires paused to whisper, and when they did, the echo was soft. And now, my friend, the fire is out. The yurt is dark, and the wind that once carried stories has settled into stillness. All around you, the past has tucked itself in. The ghost of the steppe has rolled up its memories like a sheepskin mat. There is no more riding to do tonight, no more laughing around the coals, no more lovers to find or punishments to ponder, only breath. Only the weight of a warm blanket, the steady hush of night, and the sound of your own heart slowing. You've wandered far, through yurts and thrones, through tangled braids and lonely battlefields, through strange knots and unspoken dreams. You've met Khatuns with iron hearts, generals who whispered poetry, and women who named their desires in silence. And now it's time to let them go. Let the stories fold back into the grass. Let the warriors return to their tents. Let the river forget the names of the exiled. Let the sky hold the rest. There's nothing left to do but drift. Let your shoulders soften. Let your jaw go slack. Feel the imaginary fur beneath you grow warmer, heavier. There's a soft neigh from somewhere far away, a hoof pawing gently at the earth. But it's not for you. You're not riding tonight. You're just resting. And the world, the whole wild, muddy, passionate, stormy, sleeping world of the Mongols is finally at peace. Good night. Sleep well.